So I just finished watching The Equalizer 3. Here are my thoughts. So this is the first ever trilogy in Denzel's career, which is insane to think that he had such a long career but without making a sequel or a trilogy. And this is his fifth project working with Antoine Fuqua, and they previously worked with each other on Equalizer 1, Training Day, The Magnificent Seven, Equalizer 2, and now Equalizer 3. And I do believe this is now the second director to work with Denzel for more than 4 movies. I think the late Tony Scott was the last person to work with him on 5 projects or more, and Antoine Fuqua has now equaled that. And Denzel is very high in demand, especially the presence he has in his films. So if you're lucky enough to work with him even once, then you should consider yourself blessed, and Antoine Fuqua is that person. So The Equalizer 3 is about Robert McCall, played by Denzel Washington, who is now settled down in a little town in Italy, and he's taking care of himself. He's made himself familiar with the locals know him. Essentially, it's him being retired, but don't forget, this is a former Black Ops operative who uses his skills to help those who are less fortunate. And this city is actually amazing, with a lot of people who are neighbors, a greater community, but underlying all of that, you have this really rough edge mob are in a cutthroat business and being extortionists. But don't forget, this is Denzel Washington. This is a man who I can watch sitting down in a cafe, just eating his sandwich, having a cup of tea, and I'll watch that for a full hour. That's the kind of presence this man brings to the big screen. And if it wasn't for Denzel being in these movies, I don't think this franchise would have done as well. Antoine Fuqua is a great director, don't get me wrong, but having Denzel Washington carrying these movies is something else entirely. The first film I really enjoyed. I thought it was a great movie. The second film, not so much. It's quite forgettable. Even though it had Pedro Pascal as the villain, it didn't have the same magic as the first one. However, there's still some quirky moments with those one-liners that you normally have in these sort of typical action movies, especially with Denzel delivering them.
You warning me? I'm preparing you.
And that's another thing about Denzel Washington. He brings charisma, he brings in depth, and he brings a sense of moral authority to the character. And although this is a man in his 60s who can actually bludgeon someone to death, he is still a compelling hero. And these films have some great set choreography and action set pieces. And don't forget, this is a man who's in his 60s as a character, and as the person who's playing the character, you could just sense the dread in which Robert McCall has to his victims. He even tells them, don't mess about with me. Essentially, if you mess about with me, you'll know what happens. And he gives them warnings, so it's like, why would you want to poke the bear who is trying to save you?
Whatever it is you and your friends do it somewhere else.
And that's what I like about these movies, and that's what I like about this movie. It has a themes of justice, redemption, and a desire to right wrongs. And these last few films had a great supporting cast as well. Chloe Moretz in the first one, Pedro Pascal in the second, and now you have Dakota Fanning as a supporting character in The Equalizer 3. And trust me, being a fan of Man on Fire back in 2004, I was amped for this return and this collaboration once again. Granted, the scriptwriting could be a bit better for their scenes, and the secondary storyline of having the CIA a part of this entire film, it could have been cut from the movie itself. But I still appreciated the fact that you had Dakota Fanning and Denzel Washington sharing the screen once again. I would say the pacing of this film is a bit on and off. The first, 5-10 minutes is like you have like an opening action scene, which I guess, lures you in and captures you completely. But then the next 45 minutes to an hour is more of an exposition about Denzel, or the character Robert McCall, going through his new life in Italy. Conforming to the new society that he's living in. I don't think a lot of people would appreciate that. I think they would want more action set pieces, but for me, I didn't mind, because like I said before, I don't mind. I could watch Denzel Washington sitting down in a cafe, drinking a cup of tea for an hour, and I'd watch it. That's the kind of charisma this man brings on screen. Some of the weaknesses I could say about this movie is the generic formulaic plot. It's very predictable with the way the film is going to go. You also have cliched villains. Now, you have a bunch of lower grade mobsters on the streets, which Robert McCall can just literally kill without breaking a sweat. However, you've got a big bad guy towards the end who doesn't have much screen time, which I think is a kind of a big miss. I think if you brought him in probably like at least 45 minutes to an hour earlier, just to build up that exposition, it would have been a lot better. And a lot of these villains in the past 3 movies have been generically, stereotyped, being wealthy, powerful, morally corrupt, and lacking nuance and complexity. However, I still enjoyed the movie. It wasn't bad, it wasn't great, but I still enjoyed it for what it was in the cinemas. And I recommend you check out the entire trilogy. It should be available on your streaming platforms, God knows where, but it should be available somewhere. But the first film, I would say, is probably my favorite one out of all of them, then followed by the third film, and then followed by the second. And I think that's the ranking I would get for all of these movies. But yeah, I enjoyed The Equalizer 3. Have you seen The Equalizer 3? And what are your thoughts?